The city stretched below like a restless ocean of glass and steel, its lights flickering in restless patterns against the night. Inside the penthouse, silence hung heavier than the luxury around it. She stood in the center of the vast living room, her hands trembling, her chest heaving as she fought against the humiliation tightening around her throat. The glittering chandelier above scattered shards of light across the marble floor, catching on the tears, threatening to spill from her wide eyes. Slowly she reached for the gold band clinging to her finger, that small circle of metal that symbolized everything her family had chained her into. Her breath caught as she pulled it off, the sound of metal scraping against skin unbearably loud in the quiet. She held it in her palm as though it were burning her, then let it fall to the floor. The delicate ring clattered against marble, the sound slicing through the room like a gunshot. Her heart pounded wildly as she whispered hoarsely, her voice breaking with desperation. "I took it off, please. Isn't this what you wanted?" Her knees felt weak, her body trembling with the enormity of what she had just done. She had undone the symbol of the contract, stripped herself bare of the last thread of dignity her family had left her. And yet it was not enough. With trembling fingers, she tugged at the top clasp of her gown, the soft fabric loosening slightly around her shoulders. She stood in her vulnerability, her soul screaming louder than her words, pleading with him, not only for acceptance, but for acknowledgement, for a sign that she mattered. She wanted to believe that if she offered herself this way, the walls he had built of ice and silence might crack just once. Across the room he stood, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in the shadows that clung to his cold frame. The billionaire's expression was unreadable, his eyes dark and detached, his jaw set in stone. His hands remained at his sides, fingers curled tightly but unmoving. He did not take a single step toward her. The silence stretched, threatening to suffocate her. She thought she saw his chest rise and fall, with a deeper breath, a flicker of something, anger, disbelief, or pain crossing his eyes. But it vanished as quickly as it came. He turned his head slightly, his voice cutting through the air with a blade's edge of steel. "Put it back on." Her breath hitched. The word crashed into her, sharp and merciless. She blinked, unable to comprehend them. He had not come closer, had not reached out, had not softened. His eyes were ice, harder than the diamond that glinted on the floor between them. She felt humiliation flood her cheeks, heat rising to her skin, even as cold settled into her bones. His voice struck again, colder, harsher. "Do not ever degrade yourself like this again." The weight of his rejection shattered something inside her. She clutched the fabric of her dress, her fingers trembling against the silk. Her vision blurred as tears finally spilled free, sliding down her cheeks unchecked. She had thought that by tearing down the last barrier, by surrendering to what she believed he and her family expected, she might at least gain a fragment of closeness. But he had not moved. He had not given her even a flicker of tenderness. She was left standing alone, bare in spirit, stripped not just of her ring, but of hope. Her sobs caught in her throat, muffled by the thick air of the room. Every inch of her screamed humiliation, desperation, defeat. She could hear the echo of her family's voices in her mind, demanding she do whatever it took to secure their salvation. Yet in this moment she realized that even their demands could not break through the ice that wrapped around the man before her. He was a fortress of coldness, and she was nothing but a prisoner within it. He turned away from her at last, his figure a silhouette against the city skyline. For a brief second, she thought she saw his shoulders tense, his fist clench, as if the cold mask he wore was hiding something darker, heavier. But when he finally spoke again, his tone was detached, final. "This is not what I wanted. Remember that." And with that, he walked toward the vast window, leaving her frozen in the middle of the room, the ring abandoned on the marble floor, the city lights flickering like cruel witnesses to her humiliation. She sank slowly to her knees, her tears staining the silk of her gown, her hands clutching the empty space where the ring had been. The night stretched endlessly around her, suffocating in its silence. Yet somewhere in the shadows of his eyes, unseen to her, the cold billionaire stood rigid, his heart pounding with a storm he refused to release. The story of how she came to stand in that penthouse began months earlier, when her world had collapsed under the weight of debts she had never created. Her family's empire, once glittering in the social pages, had crumbled like a castle built on sand. She remembered the night vividly, the way her father's voice had cracked. Under the strain, her mother's eyes filled with both pride and desperation, as they told her there was only one way to save them all. "Marry him," they had said, as though offering her up on a silver platter. She had protested, her voice trembling with both fear and outrage. "I cannot marry a stranger. I cannot marry a man for money." But her mother's hand had squeezed hers with an iron grip, her words chilling. "It is the only way to save us. Do this and everything will be restored. Refuse and we lose everything." The name they whispered was one that carried both awe and dread in equal measure. Alexander Knight, billionaire tycoon, a man known in financial circles for his ruthless business tactics, and in social gossip columns for his cold heart. He was not a man of parties or scandalous affairs. He was a man of silent efficiency and walls so high no one could climb them. To outsiders he was admired, to insiders he was feared, and to her family he was salvation. She remembered the first meeting clearly. She had been dressed carefully by her mother in a modest but elegant gown, her hair swept back, her palms slick with nervous sweat. When she walked into the room, he barely looked up from the document in his hand. His suit was immaculate, his hair perfectly in place, his gaze sharp and disinterested. He had not smiled, not even when her father's voice trembling introduced her. "This is my daughter. She understands the arrangement." He had finally raised his eyes to hers then, and the chill of his gaze had stolen her breath. They were not unkind, not cruel, but detached, as though he were inspecting merchandise, instead of meeting the woman who was supposed to become his wife. "Do you understand the terms?" he asked in a voice that was steady, deep, and utterly without warmth. Her throat had gone dry, but she had nodded. She had been handed a contract, thick pages, filled with clauses and signatures. At the top it read, "Marriage Agreement," though every word on the pages screamed business merger. Buried deep within the lines was the clause that had made her heart clench, the expectation that the union produce an heir within a certain time frame, ensuring the continuation of both legacies. She had tried to argue, her voice small, trembling. "I cannot sign this. This is not a marriage. This is a transaction." He had leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, and said simply, "Marriage is always a transaction. Some just dress it up with flowers and poetry." Her father had pleaded with his eyes, her mother had pressed her hand against hers, and the weight of her family's survival had crushed her resistance. With shaking fingers, she signed her name. The ink had barely dried when Alexander Knight added his own with calm precision, as though he had signed countless contracts like it before. The wedding had been swift, impersonal. There had been flowers, a dress, and photographs for the society pages, but there had been no vows whispered with sincerity, no lingering touch, no kiss that held meaning. His lips had brushed hers with the same detachment he used to sign a deal, and her heart had sunk into silence. In the days that followed, she found herself living, in his world, a world of glass towers, chauffeured cars, and endless rules. The penthouse she now called home was larger than her entire childhood estate, yet it felt emptier than a prison cell. He set the boundaries on the very first night. They had sat across from each other at a long dining table, a meal spread between them that neither touched. He had folded his hands and spoken in that same calm, cold tone. "You will have your own space. I will not interfere in your personal affairs, and I expect the same in return. Publicly, we will appear as husband and wife. Privately, we remain as we are now." She had swallowed hard, her voice breaking. "And what am I to you privately?" His gaze had not wavered. A contract fulfilled. The words had cut deeper than any knife, but she had remained silent, clinging to the fragile hope that perhaps somehow his ice might thaw. Days turned into weeks. She attended functions on his arm, smiling through the blinding flash of paparazzi cameras. Headlines screamed, "The Billionaire's Silent Bride," painting her as a mystery, a quiet ornament in his calculated life. At night she returned to the cold expanse of the penthouse, her footsteps echoing against marble floors, her loneliness pressing against her chest until she could hardly breathe. And yet in small moments she thought she glimpsed cracks in his armor. When he thought she was not watching, his shoulders would slump as he read late-night reports. His eyes would flicker toward the piano in the corner of the living room, though he never touched it. Once she caught him standing on the balcony, the city sprawling beneath him, his face etched with a loneliness so raw it made her chest ache. But when she dared to step closer, he straightened his mask, slipping back into place with practiced ease. The pressure from her family grew heavier. Each phone call from her mother was a reminder, each message from her father an accusation. "Why hasn't it happened yet? Why haven't you given him a child?" They made it sound as though her body were a bargaining chip, her soul irrelevant. She wanted to scream, to tell them she was not a machine, to produce heirs, but the words died in her throat. They had bound her fate with ink and expectation, and she was trapped. One night, after a particularly cruel call from her mother, she had broken down in the empty bedroom, clutching the silk sheets in her fists as sobs racked her body. She had whispered to the darkness, "What am I to them? What am I to him?" The silence had answered her, suffocating and absolute. From the beginning, Alexander Knight had made one thing clear: this was not love, not a union of hearts, but an agreement, written in signatures and cemented in cold logic. And yet, deep within her, a part of her still hoped that beneath the ice there was warmth, that beneath the contract there was something real. She did not know yet that the very walls he built around his heart had been forged in scars older and deeper than her own pain. All she knew was that she was bound, and that the ring she wore on her finger was not a symbol of love, but a reminder of her cage. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was both glittering and suffocating, a rhythm that left her breathless in its contrast. To the world she had everything, to herself she had nothing. The penthouse gleamed with polished marble and walls of glass that stretched up to the night sky, but the silence inside was louder than the honking horns and buzzing energy below. It was not a home, but a gilded cage, and she was the bird trapped within it. Each morning began with maids delivering breakfast on silver trays, the kind of meals that would have made her childhood self gape in awe, but she found no appetite in them. She would sip her coffee, stare at the panoramic skyline, and wonder how she had ended up here. Sometimes she tried to remind herself that it was for her family, that every night she spent in this cold space was one step closer to saving them. But the thought did little to soften the ache that wrapped around her chest. When she ventured out with him, it was never as a wife, but as an accessory. Arm in arm, they attended charity galas, high-profile dinners, business functions. He moved through those rooms like a king among pawns, his voice steady, his demeanor untouchable. She was always at his side, smiling quietly, speaking when spoken. To her presence polished but hollow, the cameras loved her silence, flashbulbs erupted. Whenever they entered a room, headlines splashed across tabloids the next morning. The billionaire's silent bride. The magazines declared, painting her as a mysterious beauty who had captured the city's coldest heart. They did not know that there was no heart captured, no love exchanged. They did not see the way his hand only touched hers for the photographers, the way his eyes slid past her once the cameras stopped flashing. She became a symbol rather than a person, an image the media could mold into whatever stories sold the most copies. Sometimes she read those articles late at night, staring at her own picture in glossy print, wondering who the woman on the page was. She barely recognized herself. She learned quickly that the cage was not just within the penthouse, but in the world outside as well. Paparazzi followed her when she went shopping, when she tried to walk in the park, when she dared to visit a cafe. Strangers whispered when they recognized her face, speculating about her life, her marriage, her role beside Alexander Knight. She heard the cruel words sometimes: trophy wife, bought bride, womb for hire. Each one sank like a stone into the hollow of her stomach, and she carried the weight of them alone. Inside the penthouse, the silence was broken only by the hum of the city far below. He would disappear into his study for hours, sometimes days, buried in work that she was not allowed to ask about. When they crossed paths, it was with polite nods and the briefest exchange of words. "Good evening. You will need to attend tomorrow's dinner. Wear the silver dress." Instructions, never conversation. Commands, never connection. She tried once to reach him, to step into his study with trembling hands and ask if they could talk, really talk. He had not raised his eyes from the papers spread before him. There was nothing to talk about. He had said, his voice quiet but final, and she had retreated with tears burning her eyes. Yet even in the cage there were moments she could not explain, moments that kept a fragile hope alive. One evening she wandered into the living room and found him standing by the piano, his hand resting lightly on the keys. The look on his face was unguarded, pained, as though the weight of the world pressed down on him. But when he noticed her, the mask snapped back in place, and he walked away without a word. Another night, she caught him on the balcony, staring down at the sprawling city, his shoulders bowed. The wind tugged at his hair, and for an instant he looked almost human, almost breakable. But when she stepped closer, he straightened his cold gaze, cutting through her attempt, and she froze where she stood. The cage grew heavier with every passing week. Her family's voices on the phone reminded her of why she was here, pressing their demands with little care for her pain. Remember what you owe us. Remember the contract. You must do your part. She would press the phone to her ear, fighting the urge to scream, knowing they would never understand. To them, she was not a daughter, not a sister, not a person. She was a solution, a means to an end. At night, she lay in her enormous bed, surrounded by luxury, drowning in loneliness. She thought about freedom, about love, about a life where she could breathe, without chains around her chest. But every time she tried to imagine escape, she saw her parents' faces, her siblings' futures, and the crushing reality of her sacrifice. She was a bird in a gilded cage, wings clipped song, silenced and yet forced to shine for the world. The headlines kept coming, the photographs kept flashing, the whispers followed her everywhere. She learned to smile on cue, to nod gracefully, to carry the mask of the perfect silent bride. But beneath it all, her heart beat restlessly, yearning for something real, something that could shatter the cage and set her free. She did not yet know that within the cold man who caged her, there was also a prisoner bound by walls higher than hers, a prisoner who would one day have to decide whether to keep her locked in ice or let both of them burn in the fire of truth. The fracture came on a night when the city glittered brightest, a gala, thrown in the name of charity, yet saturated with pride and wealth. She had been dressed in a gown chosen by him, silver silk that clung to her framed diamonds, glimmering at her throat that weighed heavier than chains. He stood beside her, immaculate as ever, his dark suit tailored like armor, his eyes scanning the crowd with the detachment of a king surveying pawns. Together they made a striking picture, the cold billionaire and his silent bride, and the flash of cameras greeted them the moment they stepped onto the red carpet. Inside the ballroom, chandeliers rained light onto marble floors. Laughter rang hollow across crystal glasses, and every eye in the room turned toward them. She kept her chin high, her smile polite, even as nerves gnawed at her stomach. She was used to whispers, to the weight of stares that judged without mercy. But tonight the judgment cut sharper. It began with a group of women draped in jewels, their perfume sweet and suffocating. One leaned close, her voice dipped in venom, masked as curiosity. So quiet, so composed. I suppose that is what he wanted, someone who will not speak out of turn. Another laughed, tilting her glass. She is just here to give him an air, nothing more. A womb dressed in silk. The words landed like blows, slicing her composure. Her breath hitched, her heart thundered in her chest, but she forced herself to stand still, to let her smile linger. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, but she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She turned slightly, searching for him, for some sign that he had heard, that he would silence them with even a glance. But Alexander Knight stood a few feet away, engaged in conversation with a group of businessmen. His profile was cut from stone, his expression as cold as ever, and though she knew he had to have heard, he gave no sign. He did not look at her, did not step forward, did not protect. It was as though the cruelty had not touched his ears, as though her humiliation was invisible to him. The women smirked satisfied and drifted away, leaving her standing in the center of the ballroom, her dignity hanging by a thread. She clenched her fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms, and forced herself to breathe. The music swelled, couples moved gracefully across the floor. Laughter bubbled like champagne, and she felt herself unraveling in the middle of it all. A photographer caught her in that moment, her eyes glistening, her smile faltering, and the next morning the tabloids would frame it as mystery once again. Silent bride or broken bride, they would wonder. She excused herself quietly, retreating to the edge of the room, her hands trembling as she pressed against the cool wall. Her heart ached not only from the words but from his silence. It was not the cruelty of strangers that shattered her, but the absence of his voice, the absence of his defense. For a moment, she thought about leaving, about running through the doors, and never looking back. But she knew the cameras would follow, the scandal would grow, and her family's calls would slice her apart by morning. So she remained standing in the shadows, her throat thick with the bitterness of betrayal. Later that night in the limousine ride back to the penthouse, silence stretched heavier than velvet. The city lights flashed through tinted glass painting, fleeting patterns across his unreadable face. She stared at him, her chest rising and falling with restrained fury, waiting for him to speak. He did not. Finally, her voice cracked through the stillness, soft but trembling. You heard them. His gaze flickered toward her, then back to the darkness beyond the glass. Yes, and you said nothing. Her words came out broken, like shards of glass cutting her tongue. His response was a wall of ice. Words of strangers do not matter. She let out a bitter laugh, tears burning her eyes. They mattered to me. His jaw tightened, but he did not reply. The rest of the ride passed in silence, each second another nail in the coffin of her fragile hope. That night she lay awake in the cavernous bed, staring at the ceiling, her hands pressed to her aching chest. For the first time since their marriage, she felt not only caged, but invisible. The fracture was small, but it cut deep a crack, spreading across the fragile glass of her endurance. She realized then that she was not only the silent bride in the world's eyes, but also in his. Her voice, her pain, her worth all dismissed, as though they did not matter. The memory of those cruel words echoed through her mind, but it was his silence that haunted her most. It was silence that would follow her into dreams, silence that would carve itself into the story of their lives. That night the cage began to splinter, and the woman inside it began to wonder how much longer she could bear the weight of chains. Forged not of gold, but of ice, it happened on a night when the city outside was restless with storm clouds. Thunder rolling faintly in the distance, lightning flashing against the glass walls of the penthouse. She had retreated to her bedroom earlier than usual, her body heavy, her chest aching with something she could not name. The humiliation of the gala still clung to her days, later wrapping around her like a second skin she could not shed. She had smiled for the cameras since then, spoken softly when necessary, carried herself with the poise expected of a billionaire's bride. But inside she felt as though she were slowly bleeding. That night she could not hide her exhaustion any longer. Fever crept through her body, her skin clammy, her breaths shallow. She curled beneath the covers, shivering despite the warmth of the room, her body trembling with weakness. She thought of calling someone, anyone, but the loneliness pressed so hard against her chest, she could not find her voice. Tears slid from her eyes, dampening the pillow, and she whispered to the empty room, "I cannot do this anymore." Somewhere in the vast penthouse, Alexander worked late as always, his study lit by the glow of monitors' reports scattered across his desk. He had buried himself in numbers and contracts, the walls of his world impenetrable. But when he finally left the study near midnight, the silence of the penthouse felt wrong. He paused, listening, and for the first time, he noticed the faint sound of coughing carried through the corridor. Something sharp tightened in his chest, though he pushed it aside as he walked toward her door. He hesitated only a moment before pushing it open. The sight stopped him cold. She lay tangled in sheets, her face flushed with fever, her lips pale, her body trembling beneath the covers. Her eyes fluttered weakly toward him, surprise and shame mingling in her gaze. Before they closed again, he felt his breath catch in his throat, an unfamiliar panic rising in his chest. Without a word, he moved to her side, pulling the blankets higher, pressing a hand against her forehead. Heat radiated against his palms, scalding dangerous. "Damn it!" he muttered, his voice cracking for the first time in years. He turned sharply, calling the staff, ordering them to bring medicine, cold cloths, water. Yet when they hurried in, he dismissed them as quickly, insisting he would handle it himself. And so he stayed. Hour after hour, as rain began to lash against the glass outside and thunder roared louder, he sat beside her, changing the damp cloth against her forehead, coaxing her to sip water when she stirred. When her fever broke into restless murmurs, he caught fragments of her voice, her mother's name, pleas for freedom, words that tore at him like claws. At one point she whispered his name, not with fear, but with a longing that pierced through his defenses. His hand lingered against hers, longer than it should have, his thumb brushing across her knuckles before he pulled away, as though burned. He told himself it was duty, that he had a responsibility to maintain appearances, but deep down he knew it was more. Hours passed. The storm outside softened, leaving only the sound of her breathing and the faint hum of the city. He remained by her side, his posture rigid, but his eyes never straying from her fragile form. He watched the way her brow furrowed in sleep, the way her lips parted as though searching for words she could not speak. Something inside him twisted painfully, something he had locked away long ago. He reached out once more, brushing a damp strand of hair from her cheek, his fingers trembling despite his usual control. He leaned closer, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You deserve more than this, more than me." The words left his lips before he could stop them, hanging in the air like a confession he would never repeat. He sat back staring at her, his chest tight, his mind reeling with emotions he had sworn never to feel again. He remembered the woman who had once stood where she now lay, another bride, another promise that had shattered into betrayal. He remembered the bitterness that had hardened him, the doctor's words about his health that had convinced him love was nothing but a cruel illusion. Yet here she was, her presence softening the walls. He had built her vulnerability, forcing him to face his own. When dawn broke, painting the room in hues of gold, her fever finally eased. Her breathing steadied, her face lost its painful flush. Exhaustion claimed her, but peace lingered in her expression. He sat back weary but strangely reluctant to leave. When she stirred, her lashes fluttering, eyes cracked open, the first thing she saw was him. For a heartbeat, confusion flickered in her gaze, then something else, hope. But before she could speak, before the fragile moment could shatter the walls he had so carefully maintained. He rose to his feet. "Rest," he said curtly, his voice once again shielded in ice. "You will recover." And without another glance, he walked out the mask, settling firmly back into place. She lay there, her heart pounding, tears filling her eyes, not from the fever, but from the memory of his presence, the faint trace of tenderness she had felt when she was too weak to resist. She clutched the sheets to her chest, whispering to herself, "He cares. He must care." She wanted to believe it, even as doubt gnawed at her. Somewhere down the hall, Alexander stood in the shadows of his study, staring out at the rising sun. His jaw clenched, his fists tight, as though fighting a battle no one could see. His heart still beat faster than it should. His mind still replayed the sound of her broken whispers, the warmth of her skin beneath his hand. He told himself it was nothing, that it was weakness, but deep down he knew the truth. Something inside him had shifted, something that terrified him more than any boardroom battle ever could. And though neither of them would admit it yet, the storm that had passed outside had left behind a quiet tenderness, unspoken but undeniable, a fragile thread tying their hearts together in ways neither contract nor cage could break. The fever left her weak for several days, but it left behind something else too, something she could not name yet felt in every breath when he passed by. The memory of his presence at her bedside haunted her. The sound of his voice, whispering words he thought she would never hear, carved itself into her heart. She began to look at him differently, searching his face for traces of the man she had glimpsed that night, the man hidden behind walls of ice. He remained distant, his tone clipped, his eyes unreadable, yet there were cracks now, hairline fractures she could almost touch. One morning she found him on the balcony, his tie loosened, his gaze fixed on the city below. The wind stirred his dark hair, and for once he looked less like a statue, carved from stone, and more like a man bearing the weight of the world. She hesitated at the doorway, then stepped out quietly, the sound of her footsteps almost swallowed by the city noise below. For a moment he did not move, then he said without looking at her, "You should be resting." She swallowed, gathering her courage. "You stayed with me." He turned his head slightly, his eyes sharp, but his voice flat. "You were ill. That was all." She nodded, though she did not believe him. She had felt the warmth in his touch, heard the truth in his whispered words. His denial was just another wall, but now she knew those walls could be breached. Later that week, at another glittering dinner, she caught him watching her from across the table. It was not the cold, dismissive stare she was used to, but something softer, something he quickly masked when their eyes met. Her heart raced, and she found herself smiling faintly, a smile meant for him alone, even though he looked away. The smallest things began to change. She noticed the way he lingered longer at the dining table instead of retreating immediately to his study. Once, when she laughed at something a guest said, his gaze flickered toward her, the corner of his mouth twitching as if he almost smiled. Another evening she tripped slightly on the marble floor, her heels betraying her, and before she could fall, he caught her by the wrist, steadying her with surprising gentleness. For a fleeting second their eyes locked, his grip firm, his touch electric. She felt her pulse race, her lips part, but he released her quickly, stepping back as though burned. "Be careful," he said curtly, and walked away, but the tremor in his voice lingered in her mind long after. she began to realize that beneath his cold exterior there was a man who fought battles no one could see, battles that kept him from allowing himself to feel. She wanted to know more, to understand what had built the fortress around his heart. She started to notice details, the way he avoided certain songs when they played at galas, the way his jaw tightened whenever conversations turned to family or children, the way his eyes clouded when he thought no one was watching. One evening she found herself alone in the music room. The piano stood silent in the corner, gleaming under the soft lights. She sat at the bench, her fingers trembling as they touched the keys. She had learned as a child, and though she had not played in years, the notes came slowly, hesitantly forming a melody that filled the empty room. She did not know he was standing at the doorway until she looked up. His expression was unreadable, but there was a shadow of something in his eyes, pain, longing, maybe even memory. For a long moment he said nothing, then finally he turned away. His voice quiet. "Do not play that piece again." She blinked, startled. Why? He paused, his shoulders tense. "Because it belongs to someone else." He walked away, leaving her heart pounding with questions she could not ask. That night she lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering who that someone else was, and what had happened to leave him so scarred. She felt a strange ache in her chest, not just for herself but for him, for the loneliness she saw every time his mask slipped. And though she knew he would deny it, though he would fight against it, with every ounce of control he possessed, she felt the truth stirring between them. The ice was beginning to crack. It was subtle, fragile, easily denied, but it was there in every glance too long, in every touch too quick, in every word unspoken that lingered in the air like a ghost. The cage that trapped her was still there, the contract still bound them, but for the first time she wondered if they were both prisoners. If the man she thought of as cold and unfeeling was as desperate for freedom as she was. The breaking point came not with shouting or scandal, but with the quiet cruelty of words spoken over a phone call. Her mother's voice cut into her like a knife, sharp and unforgiving, reminding her of the weight she carried. Why has nothing happened yet? Why hasn't he claimed you? Do not forget the contract. Everything depends on you. She gripped the edge of the vanity, her knuckles white, tears stinging her eyes as she listened. "I am trying," she whispered, her voice breaking, but the line had already gone cold. The pressure swelled like a storm inside her chest, pressing until she could hardly breathe. Every glance at the untouched bed beside hers, every night spent in silence, while he worked behind closed doors, every reminder of her family's demands built into a crushing weight she could no longer bear. That night she reached her limit. The penthouse was silent, the city glittering far below, and she stood in the living room with her heart hammering in her chest. She thought of her family, of their collapsing empire, of the cage she had been forced into, and of the man who stood always just out of reach, colder than the marble floors she walked upon. Desperation pushed her into action. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the band on her finger, the ring that bound her to him, the symbol of a contract rather than love. With a sharp tug, she pulled it free, her chest heaving with sobs. The small circle of gold felt heavier than stone, burning in her palm as though mocking her. She let it drop to the floor with a sharp clink that echoed in the empty air. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she looked toward him. He had just entered the room, his tall figure framed by the glow of the city lights pouring through the glass wall. His eyes locked onto her as she fumbled with the clasp of her gown, pulling it loose, just enough for the fabric to slip from her shoulders. Tears blurred her vision, but she lifted her chin, her voice breaking with anguish. "I took it off, please. Isn't this what you wanted?" Her words trembled, in the silence, her body shaking with shame and despair. She felt raw, exposed, her dignity unraveling before him. She had convinced herself that this was what he expected, what her family demanded, what the contract had been built upon. Her heart screamed for him, to see her, to want her, to choose her. For one unbearable moment, he did not move. His eyes darkened, his jaw set, and she thought she saw the flicker of something dangerous flash across his gaze. But then his voice broke the silence, colder than the storm outside. "Put it back on." The words cut sharper than any blade. Her breath hitched the tears spilling freely down her cheeks. She shook her head in disbelief, sobbing, "I am trying to be what you want. I am trying to be what they want. Why is it never enough?" His expression did not soften. His tone was flat, unyielding. "Because this is not what I want." She felt her knees buckle, her body folding as she sank to the floor, her sobs echoing through the cavernous room. The ring lay between them like a broken promise, a symbol of everything she had sacrificed, everything she had lost. Her gown clung to her trembling form, her hands clutching at her chest, as though to hold herself together. "Then what am I to you?" she cried, her voice shattering under the weight of despair. He turned away his face, shadowed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His silence was an answer, one that broke her heart more than cruelty ever could. He walked past her, his footsteps heavy against the marble, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. She was left alone in the vast glittering cage, her sobs the only sound filling the emptiness. She pressed her forehead to the floor, the cold seeping into her skin, her tears pooling beneath her. She thought of her family's demands, of the contract that had stolen her freedom, of the man who refused to see her pain. The hopelessness swallowed her whole, leaving her trembling and broken. But what she did not see, what she could not know, was that just beyond the corner of the hallway, Alexander Knight had stopped, his back pressed against the wall, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. His jaw was clenched so tight it ached, his eyes burning with emotions he could no longer deny. He had heard her sobs, each one a dagger in his chest, and it took every ounce of his will to stay hidden in the shadows. He could not let her see. He could not let her know how much her pain had shattered him. He had built his world on silence, on ice, on control, and in a single night she had cracked it open with her desperation. His fist struck the wall once, a silent curse escaping his lips, before he turned and walked deeper into the darkness, leaving her to believe he felt nothing. In truth, he felt everything. That night she believed herself utterly alone, but he too lay awake in his own room, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the sound of her broken plea. For the first time in years, he could not escape the storm raging inside him, a storm she had awakened with the words that would echo in his mind long after her tears had dried. The days after that night stretched endlessly, every moment filled with a silence heavier than stone. She moved through the penthouse like a ghost. Her eyes swollen from tears, she tried to hide her voice quiet, even when she forced herself to speak. He buried himself deeper in work, disappearing into his study, until dawn, emerging with the same icy mask that had begun to crack, but that he now forced into place with renewed determination. But silence could not hold forever, not when the world outside thrived on whispers and scandal. The first headline broke like a thunderclap across the morning papers, "The Billionaire's Bride Expecting." Her breath caught as she stared at the words printed in bold across glossy pages, her photograph plastered beneath them, her hand resting unconsciously against her stomach, in a shot taken as she left a charity dinner weeks earlier. The article gushed about heirs and legacies, about how the cold Alexander Knight had finally fulfilled his duty, about how the contract that bound them had blossomed into a future neither had anticipated. She dropped the paper, her hands trembling, her heart pounding with dread. She had not spoken a word to anyone. She was not pregnant. The realization slammed into her like a blow. Her family. They had planted the rumor, fed it to the press, twisted her silence into headlines. Within hours, paparazzi swarmed outside the penthouse, their cameras flashing day and night, their voices shouting questions that stabbed at her like knives. When is the baby due? Was this a planned pregnancy? Is this the reason for the contract marriage? She retreated further into the penthouse closing curtains, avoiding windows, her body shaking with the weight of lies she could not control. When she confronted her mother over the phone, her voice cracked with anger. "Why would you do this? Why would you lie?" Her mother's reply was chilling. "It was necessary. This is the only way to secure our place. Now the world believes it. Now he has no choice." She had wanted to scream, but the line went dead before she could speak. Later that evening, Alexander appeared at her door, the paper folded neatly in his hand, his expression unreadable. "Do you know about this?" He asked, his voice low but firm. She shook her head violently, tears brimming in her eyes. "I had nothing to do with it. It was them, my family." His jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with something sharp, anger, disappointment, something she could not decipher. "This will not stand," he said coldly. She wanted to ask what that meant, but the words died on her lips as he turned and walked away, the door closing behind him like a gavel striking down. Days later, the situation exploded. Invitations had been sent, reporters gathered, lights and microphones prepared. He had called a press conference, and though she had not wanted to go, she had been forced to stand by his side, her heart pounding as hundreds of cameras pointed at her. The stage was set in one of his hotels, grand and gleaming, the ballroom filled with journalists hungry for scandal. She stood there, her silver dress suffocating against her skin, her hands trembling as they clutched one another, her eyes downcast. Alexander stood beside her, tall and unyielding, his expression as cold as marble. When the reporters shouted questions, flashes exploding, she felt as though she were drowning. The lies pressed against her chest, suffocating her, until suddenly she could not breathe. She could not do it anymore. The words burst from her lips like a dam breaking. "I am not pregnant." The room fell silent. Dozens of cameras captured her trembling figure, her tear-stained face, her voice breaking as she forced herself to continue. "I was never his real wife. I was just a contract." Gasps rippled through the crowd, microphones thrust forward, questions hurled in chaos, but she pressed on, her sobs choking each word. "They used me, my own family, they used him, and I was too weak to fight. But I cannot live like this anymore. I cannot live a lie." The room erupted, voices shouting, cameras flashing like lightning. She turned toward Alexander, then her tears streaming, her body trembling. He stood frozen, his expression unreadable, his eyes locked onto hers. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw something flicker there, something human, something wounded, but it was gone too quickly to know. She reached for the ring on her finger, her hands shaking as she pulled it free. The gold band glinted under the harsh lights as she held it up, her voice trembling with finality. This is not marriage. This is not love. She placed the ring on the podium before her, the small sound of metal against wood echoing louder than any shout in the room. Then, without another word, she turned her silver gown trailing behind her as she walked through the sea of reporters, their voices a cacophony, their flashes blinding. She did not look back. Alexander remained standing, his jaw tight, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The cameras caught everything: her tears, her confession, her final act of defiance. By the next morning, every paper in the city carried the image of her, walking away, headlines screaming, "Betrayal Contract Bride." The billionaire's shame. Alone in the back of the car that carried her away from the press, she pressed her hands against her chest, sobs racking her body. She had broken the contract, shattered the lie, but in doing so she had shattered herself. She knew the world would crucify her, knew her family would rage, knew she had nothing left to stand on. Yet for the first time in months, she felt something close to freedom. Somewhere in the city, Alexander stood before the press, still buzzing with chaos. The ring abandoned on the podium, his eyes fixed on it, as though it held the weight of his soul. For the first time in years, his walls had not protected him. For the first time, the cold billionaire felt the sting of a wound he could not hide. And though he said nothing, he turned and walked away from the flashing cameras deep inside, he knew this was not the end. Something had broken that night. Not just the contract, but the silence that had defined their lives. The scandal did not fade with time. It grew fed by every headline, every photograph, every whisper that spread like wildfire across the city. She retreated into obscurity, hiding from the relentless cameras, from the accusations and pitying glances that followed her wherever she went. Alone in a modest apartment, far from the penthouse, she lay awake at night, replaying the scene at the press conference over and over, the weight of the ring, leaving her finger still burning in her palm. She told herself she had done the right thing, that she had reclaimed. Her voice broken free from the cage, yet her heart ached with a hollow pain that no freedom could soothe. She missed him, not the cold mask he showed the world, but the man she had glimpsed in fleeting moments. The man who had sat at her bedside, who had whispered words of truth when he thought she could not hear. She missed the cracks in his armor, the glimpses of a soul bound in chains as heavy as hers. And somewhere else in the city, Alexander Knight sat in the vast emptiness of his penthouse, staring at the ring she had left behind. He had picked it up from the podium that night, slipping it into his pocket without a word, and since then he had carried it with him like a shard of glass lodged in his chest. He had watched the headlines twist the truth, paint her as a liar, a manipulator, a failed bride. He had said nothing to correct them. His silence was his shield, but inside it was killing him. He stood alone on the balcony, the wind whipping against his face, his chest tight with the secret he had carried for years. The reason he had agreed to the contract, the reason he had built walls of ice so high no one could climb them, was not simply pride or bitterness. It was fear. Years earlier, doctors had told him the truth he never shared. A heart condition, genetic, progressive. a shadow lurking in his bloodline. He remembered sitting in the sterile white of the hospital, his fists clenched, his throat dry, as the words echoed, "You should not strain yourself. You should not expect to live a long life, and you should never, under any circumstances, pass this on to a child." Those words had frozen him, sealing him in a prison of his own making. Love, marriage, family. All of it became poisoned in his mind. He had sworn never to risk dragging another soul into his suffering, never to give the world a child that might inherit his curse. That was why he had refused her pleas, why he had turned away when her family demanded she bear him an heir. He had not been cold because he wanted nothing. He had been cold because he wanted everything too much, and fear made him destroy it before it could bloom. He remembered the woman he had once loved years ago, who had left when he finally told her the truth. Her rejection had carved the last pieces of warmth out of him. He had vowed never to allow that pain again. So when her family came offering their daughter as salvation in exchange for survival, he had agreed to the contract on one condition, that it remain just that, a contract. No intimacy, no heirs, no love. It had been cruel, but it had been his way of keeping her safe from his truth. Yet as he stood there now, the ring warm in his palm, he realized the cruelest part was that he had failed anyway. She had suffered not from his illness, but from his silence, from the ice he had wrapped around himself like armor. He had thought he was protecting her, but he had only destroyed her. His hand shook as he gripped the railing, his eyes fixed on the glittering lights below. For the first time, he admitted to himself that he loved her. He had loved her from the moment she walked into his office, trembling but defiant, signing away her freedom to save her family. He had loved her in every glance she dared, to meet his eyes in every quiet smile she gave to the cameras, in every tear she shed when she thought no one could see. He had loved her in the moment she whispered his name in fever, her hand clutching at his, her body burning as he sat helpless. And he had loved her when she stood before the world, breaking herself to speak the truth, tearing down the cage, even as she shattered her own heart. He loved her, and it terrified him. Alone in the shadows of his penthouse, Alexander Knight finally allowed himself to break. He sank into the leather chair by the window, his head in his hands. The ring pressed against his forehead as though it could burn the truth into his skin. For the first time in years, he wept silent tears sliding down the face the world had only ever seen as carved in stone. The truth beneath the cold was not absence, but abundance, not apathy, but love so fierce it had been strangled by fear. And now he realized that if he did not fight for her, if he did not finally lay bare his soul, he would lose the only chance he had left to live for something beyond his illness, beyond his empire, beyond himself. The world had already written its story. Headlines screamed of betrayal, of a broken marriage of a billionaire, shamed before the cameras. Gossip columns dissected every moment of the press conference, every angle of the photographs, every tear that had fallen down her cheeks. She hid from it all, retreating further into her modest apartment, refusing to answer calls, shutting herself away from the endless speculation. But Alexander Knight could not hide. His empire demanded his presence. His board pressed him for explanations. His investors threatened to pull away. Yet through it all, he carried the ring she had left behind, his hand brushing against it inside his pocket like a talisman, a constant reminder of what he had lost. For days he wrestled with silence, his instinct to protect himself, clashing with the knowledge that silence had already destroyed the one thing that mattered. He had built a fortress around himself for so long that tearing it down felt like stepping off the edge of a cliff. But he knew he had no choice. The city buzzed with expectation when the announcement came that Alexander Knight would be holding a press conference of his own. Journalists filled the grand hall of his flagship hotel, cameras ready the air electric with the promise of scandal. When he walked onto the stage, his presence was as commanding as ever. But tonight there was something different. His shoulders, usually stiff with control, were set with determination. His jaw, usually tight with indifference, trembled slightly under the weight of what he carried. He stood before the microphones, the ring clutched in his palm, and looked out at the sea of faces waiting to tear him apart. His voice, when it came, was steady but raw. "You all want a story. You want to know the truth about my marriage, about the contract, about the woman who stood before you and confessed what no one else had the courage to say. So I will give you the truth." The room fell silent. Cameras clicked, pens scratched furiously, but no one dared interrupt. He held up the ring, the symbol that had become a weapon, and his voice broke as he continued. "She was never just a contract. From the moment she walked into my life, she was more. I was too blind to admit it, too much of a coward to face it. But she was never an accessory, never an obligation. She was my heart. Even when I convinced myself to treat her as nothing, she was everything." A ripple of shock swept through the room, but he pressed on, his voice growing stronger. "I made her suffer. I let her believe she was worthless, that her pain did not matter. I let her family use her, let the world mock her. Let her cry alone in a cage I built with my own hands. And I did it all because I was afraid. Afraid of love, afraid of loss, afraid of the truth of my own life." He paused, his eyes closing briefly, before opening again, gaze steady, unwavering. "I have a condition, a weak heart, a legacy of pain passed down to me by blood. I was told not to marry, not to have children, not to give anyone a chance to carry this curse. So I convinced myself it was better to be cold, better to be silent, better to push her away than to risk breaking her with the truth. But in doing so, I broke her anyway." The words cracked his composure, slipping, but he did not stop. He stepped closer to the microphones, the cameras capturing every flicker of vulnerability across his face. "If you remember one thing from tonight, let it be this: she is not a contract bride. She is not a scandal. She is not a pawn. She is the bravest, kindest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. And if she never forgives me, I will carry that until my last breath. But I cannot remain silent any longer." His voice lowered, trembling with emotion. "So this is my declaration, not as a billionaire, not as a name in your papers, but as a man. I love her. I have always loved her, and I will spend whatever time I have left proving it." The room erupted, cameras, flashing, voices rising. But Alexander did not stay to answer questions. He walked off the stage, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. But for the first time in years, he felt lighter, as though the chains around his heart had shattered. Across the city, she sat on her couch, her television flickering with the live broadcast. She had not wanted to watch, had tried to block him from her mind. But when his face filled the screen and his voice carried through the speakers, she could not look away. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she listened, her hands clutching at her chest, her heart breaking all over again at the raw truth he bared before the world. And when he spoke the words she had longed to hear, when he said "I love her" with no hesitation, no mask, she crumpled into sobs, the sound echoing through the tiny apartment. For the first time since she had walked away, she let herself believe that perhaps, despite everything, despite the pain and lies and silence, love could still be real. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew this was not the end of their story, but the beginning of something new. The morning after his declaration, the city buzzed with shock and fascination. Headlines screamed not of scandal, but of redemption. For the first time, Alexander Knight had bared his soul before the world, and the world could not look away. Yet none of it mattered to him. The only thing that mattered was her. He found her not in the glittering halls of power, or behind the tinted glass of limousines, but in the quiet of her modest apartment. He arrived unannounced, his usually perfect suit rumpled from lack of sleep. His tie loosened, his eyes raw with the weight of sleepless nights. She opened the door with hesitation, her heart hammering at the sight of him. Standing there, vulnerability in every line of his posture. For a moment, neither spoke. She stared at him, remembering every wound, every silence, every moment he had let her stand alone. He stared at her, remembering every tear he had caused, every chance he had wasted. Finally, he stepped forward, pulling the ring from his pocket, holding it out not as a contract but as a plea. His voice was low, steady, but trembling with sincerity. "This is not business. This is not obligation. This is not about heirs or contracts or appearances. This is only about us. About what I feel, about what I can no longer hide. I love you, and this time the choice is yours. Not your family's, not mine. Only yours." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at the small circle of gold, no longer a chain, but a promise. She thought of the girl who had once stood trembling in his office, forced to sign away her freedom. She thought of the woman who had walked away in front of cameras, broken but unbowed, and now standing in the doorway with the man who had finally laid himself bare. She realized she was free at last, free to choose, and she chose him. With trembling hands, she reached out and took the ring, slipping it back onto her finger, not as a prisoner, but as a partner. He exhaled shakily, relief flooding his features as he pulled her into his arms. For the first time, there was no hesitation, no distance. His embrace was warm, desperate, real. She clung to him, tears falling freely, her heart breaking and healing all at once. "I love you," she whispered against his chest, the words muffled but certain. He tightened his hold, his own tears dampening her hair, and for the first time the cold billionaire melted entirely, leaving only a man who had finally found home. News of their reunion spread quickly, but this time the headlines carried no cruelty. Photographs captured them, walking hand in hand through the city, her smile radiant, his eyes no longer void, but alive with something the world had never seen in him. The press called it a transformation, a love story reborn. They called it From Cold Contract to True Love. But for them it was simpler. It was a new dawn. Days became brighter, nights warmer. The penthouse no longer felt like a cage, but a sanctuary, filled with laughter and conversation instead of silence. She played the piano again, her melodies filling the rooms, and this time he sat beside her listening, sometimes even daring to touch the keys himself. They still carried scars, both of them, but they carried them together. She no longer cried alone in the night, and he no longer stood on the balcony bearing his pain in silence. When storms came, they faced them side by side. When joy arrived, they shared it openly, unafraid. Love had not erased the past, but it had rewritten the future. And as they stood together on that same balcony months later, the city sprawling beneath them, her hand resting in his, she knew that this was where she was meant to be. Not as a contract, not as a symbol, but as his choice, his partner, his love. The cold had finally broken. Warmth had taken its place. The dawn had come. Before you leave, take a deep breath with me. Did you feel your heart breaking when she whispered, "I took it off, please"? And he froze in silence, leaving her shattered on the floor. Did you cry when she stood trembling before the world, confessing through tears that she was never a wife, only a contract? And did your soul tremble when the cold billionaire finally shattered his own walls, standing before flashing cameras and declaring the words he had been too afraid to say? She was never a contract. She was my heart. If you felt those waves of pain and healing, if your chest tightened as their brokenness turned into redemption, then you understand why we tell these stories. Because sometimes love is not gentle. Sometimes it drags us through storms, through cages, through lies and silence, until only the strongest pieces remain. And yet love heals, it redeems, it rewrites endings we thought were set in stone. Tonight you saw how a woman once silenced found her voice, how a man once frozen by fear found the courage to speak, and how the world could not stop two hearts from choosing each other freely. That is not just fiction, that is the echo of every heart that has ever fought for love. So now I ask you, if you were her, could you forgive him? Could you look at the man who caged you and see the boy who was caged himself? Could you slip that ring back on, not as a contract, but as a choice of love? Tell me in the comments, because your voice matters here. And if this story made you cry, made you believe, made you remember that love can break even the coldest silence, then share it with someone who needs hope tonight. Let this tale reach hearts that have almost given up. Remind them that even behind the harshest walls, love is waiting to be set free. Rate this story from 0 to 10. Let us know where in the world you're watching from, and do not forget to subscribe, because every week we bring you another journey through pain and redemption, despair and healing, heartbreak and true love. Thank you for staying until the very end, for letting your heart ride this roller coaster with us. Until the next story, hold on to this truth: love may be hidden, love may be silenced, but love, true love, always finds its way.